As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the big news over the weekend was that this truce between Hamas and Israel ended Friday morning, and Israel resumed its brutal assault on Gaza with just relentless airstrikes, and now they're saying they're expanding the ground operations into the south. The Israeli military said on Sunday that its ground operations have expanded to every part of the Gaza Strip and vowed that its assault on the south will be just as big as it was in the north. This is the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi. He said, quote, "It will be no less powerful than the operations in northern Gaza. It will have no less results. We have the capabilities to do it in the most thorough way, and just as we did it with strength and thoroughly in the north of the Gaza Strip, we are also doing it now in the south of the Gaza Strip, and we also continue to deepen the achievements in the north of the Gaza Strip," end quote. So a lot of the airstrikes were actually still in the north, but now they've really ramped things up in the south as well. And if you remember, in the last show, I covered Blinken's visit to Israel, and what was the thing that he said he told these Israeli officials? He said that he told them to account for the civilians in southern Gaza before expanding operations there. And he also said that they could not kill as many civilians in the south as they did in the north. And here you have IDF spokesman, or sorry, not the spokesman, the head of the IDF, the Israeli military chief, saying, we're expanding it. It's going to be just as big, just as brutal as it was in the north, in the south. So it just goes to show that Israeli officials are ignoring all these warnings from the U.S. about civilian casualties. And some other news that came out over the weekend is that the U.S. has been shipping Israel 2,000-pound bombs. So while on one hand you have these U.S. officials saying that they care about civilian casualties, they're also shipping these huge, powerful bombs that Israel is using on Gaza, which is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. They're shipping them these weapons, setting no red lines. We keep hearing that it's unconditional military aid. So how could they really be concerned about these civilian casualties? So the Pentagon said on Sunday that a U.S. Navy destroyer and several commercial vessels came under attack in the Red Sea. So later on Sunday, this was first reported by the Associated Press, and then later on Sunday, U.S. Central Command kind of detailed what happened in the Red Sea. According to them, according to the U.S. military, they said that the USS Carney, which is a U.S. Navy destroyer, responded to attacks on 3 commercial vessels named the Unity Explorer, the Number 9, and the Sophie 2. CENTCOM said that the Carney shot down a total of 3 drones, including 2 that were heading in its direction. So 2 that they said appeared to be fired at this ship. And CENTCOM blamed the attacks on Yemen's Houthis. And the Houthis did announce that they attacked 2 of the ships, the Unity Explorer and the Number 9, but they did not mention firing on the USS Carney. There's a chance here that the Carney responded, was going around to these ships and just downed drones that were fired at the ships, and that it wasn't exactly under attack. It's not clear here what the full story is, but the fact that they're blaming the Houthis and they're claiming that the attacks were fully enabled by Iran, which there's no indication Iran was involved at all. The Houthis are aligned with Iran politically, but they're not, an Iranian proxy to the extent that people try to portray them as. They act very independently. And CENTCOM said that the U.S. will consider all appropriate responses. So this is just another area where things could really escalate. If the U.S. starts bombing the Houthis directly, or who knows what they might do if they're blaming Iran. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Saturday that the alliance must be prepared for bad news about Ukraine and urged support for continuing the proxy war against Russia. Stoltenberg said, quote, "Wars develop in phases. We have to support Ukraine in both good and bad times. We should also be prepared for bad news," end quote. Stoltenberg acknowledged Ukraine has been unable to move the front line, but claimed that Ukrainian forces were still achieving big victories. He previously argued that Ukraine was having some success because it was inflicting heavy losses on Russia, although we know Ukraine is facing a serious manpower shortage. Stoltenberg's comments came after Zelensky acknowledged to the Associated Press that the counteroffensive, Ukraine's big counteroffensive, was a failure. He said, quote, "We wanted faster results. From that perspective, unfortunately, we did not achieve the desired results, and that is a fact," end quote. Despite the lack of success, Zelensky said that he's not backing down and that the conflict is entering a second phase. He says they're going to keep going. Stoltenberg says, let's keep funding this thing. That's what Biden is saying as well, even while they're focused on Gaza. Doesn't matter. Let's just keep the war going. And Russia is also digging in for a long war. Putin ordered the military to increase its number of troops by nearly 170,000. That would bring the strength of Russia's armed forces to 1.32 million people, and the overall number of Russian military personnel to about 2.2 million. Ukraine is also looking for ways to bolster its depleted forces, including by expanding the draft. The Ukrainian military wants Zelensky to sign off on a plan to lower the age of involuntary conscription for men without military experience to 25, which could add around 140,000 recruits. Right now, the rules are nobody under 27 could be conscripted if they don't have prior military service. They can volunteer to fight, obviously. So they're thinking about ways to, add to the fighting force. And, if they do this, it's going to be more young Ukrainian men who are killed or maimed in this war that could just go on for who knows how long.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
That this quite stunning and indeed quite lopsided victory, it does mean something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the Argentinian population suddenly became libertarian. That, as in the United States, a very small percentage of the country is libertarian, but it does mean something. And Octavio, what do you think it means?
Well, I totally agree with the idea that it doesn't mean that the 55% of the people that voted for Milei are libertarians. That's unthinkable. A small percentage of them are libertarians. So, but what does this mean? It means that people have realized that the model espoused by the ruling Peronist leftist, for the people that don't know what Peronism is, some kind of leftist New Dealers kind of stuff. Well, the people have realized that that model of a country, that economic program doesn't work anymore. It doesn't bring up good results. So they have a notion of going towards the free market, but it's just a notion. It's not a full system of ideas. And by this, I mean that they are not full. I mean, this 55%, that they are not full libertarians. Of course, that would be my take on that.
Well, this was more or less what I assumed, because this would have been an absolutely revolutionary transformation of a country. But on the other hand, Jacob, I would think that if he does have some success and remains popular, that the ideas of libertarianism, whether or not he describes them that way, will come to be understood better by people. And certainly that has to be a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. And he does describe them that way. I mean, if you've seen these videos, he talks about anarcho-capitalism. He talks about libertarianism. He says all the kinds of things that we would say in talking to the public in Argentina. He doesn't code it. He doesn't hide it. He says very much what he is and makes it clear. And yet, and people don't, I don't think, from what I'm hearing, talking to people, don't fully understand that. But he has this extraordinary, engaging personality and this sort of cult of personality that he's developed around himself, that he's used to draw attention to himself and to these ideas. And while people might not understand libertarianism or really understand free market economics, it's very easy to understand that inflation in their country is at 150% or whatever, and that prices are constantly going up in a way that they can't keep up with, and that something different has to be better. And so I get the sense that people, they recognize that they need a change. They recognize that even if they don't understand every word that's coming out of his mouth, that whatever it is, it's definitely different, and it has a certain appeal, and that's exactly the right climate, apparently, to get people to jump on board something like this. So I think it's the combination of difference from the status quo and just an extraordinary, captivating personality. And my understanding is that although adults aren't necessarily getting the whole philosophy, they're just kind of getting the gist of it, young people who gravitate toward new ideas are listening. And I've been told by people here on the ground that if you go to high schools, high schoolers, it turns out in Argentina of a certain age, I believe it's 16 to 18, can vote if they want to. If you're older than that, you have to vote. But if you're in high school, apparently you have the option to vote. And these kids are going to the Austrian libertarian literature to find out more about this. And so whatever goes on in the short term, it seems like the expression of these ideas is planting seeds for the long term that we can be optimistic about in any event.
Well, I would guess Octavio would have some insight into that, given that, may I disclose your age, Octavio?
Yes.
Okay, Octavio is as a lad of a mere 19 years. So I rather suspect you have some sense of how younger people are thinking.
Well, yeah, younger people have realized that their previous generation has failed in giving them a future. So they have gravitated towards Milei, towards his ideas. And a very important thing that Milei did when speaking in public was to cite libertarian authors like Murray Rothbard, or Ludwig von Mises, or Friedrich Hayek. That's where I came from. I heard those quotes and I just Googled who were these people. And there's where I come from. And many of the younger people that I know happen to be in the same situation. In high school, what's happening is incredible. The students are standing up to their professors, who are not usually left-leaning or outright communists. They are standing up to them and saying to them, what you're saying is wrong according to sound economic theory. And that's incredible. And there's been I totally agree with Jacob, there's been a cultural shift. And that shift in the long term is positive, but it also depends on Milei's administration. If it is successful, then we'll see these ideas grow. People gravitate towards Austrian economics, libertarianism.
He had some choice words for his for the advertisers who are giving him grief.
If somebody's going to try to blackmail me with advertising, blackmail me with money, go fuck yourself. But go fuck yourself. Is that clear? I hope it is. Hey, Bob, if you're in the audience.
That, of course, was a direct reference to the Disney CEO. So that was Elon Musk. Now, the question, it was posed in a way where they asked him if going to Israel was like an apology tour. So I think part of that also is that they were almost kind of implying like, oh, you're being a bitch. And then he had to like kind of let them know that he's not. Anyway, there's been a wide reaction to this. And I'm sure that if you were, let's say you were like in advertising sales or something like that for Twitter, you probably wouldn't be thrilled that the owner of the company is out there saying that. I have a little bit of a different take on it, but let's first, before we get into my take or your take, Rob, we got to go to the expert. And these days, he's someone we always look to for guidance, and he's been sorely missing in our thoughts and in our hearts. But here he was weighing in on this because he's still such a powerful voice that he's still relevant enough to keep landing on his fat little feet. So here he is, our favorite little piggy, Brian Stelter.
Bottom line here is that he can call it blackmail. He can say advertisers are trying to blackmail him. But I think what the other way to frame that would be, this is a version of a freedom of speech debate. Advertisers have a choice about where they spend money and where they don't spend money. That's what sponsors can decide. The same is true here on television with News Nation. Advertisers choose where to put their messages. That's what's happening here. It's very much a free speech issue. So he can call it blackmail, but I think this is of his own making. And he did acknowledge on stage, advertisers might kill his company. If really no one's willing to advertise on X, then that is going to kill his company. But that's the free market deciding.
Right. He wanted it to be the ultimate free speech, the home of free speech, essentially, the ultimate town squares he talked about. But to your point now, free speech, it works both ways. And the advertisers have their free speech.
Blackmail, like this whole talk, he goes, well, I wouldn't characterize it as blackmail. I'd characterize it as free markets. You're like, well, yes, blackmail, that's what it is. I mean, but like if you're saying like, oh, I have a right to say what I want to say, like it's a free speech issue. It's like, yeah, that's kind of consistent with what blackmail is. It's like, I know something about you and I have a right to say it. So I'm going to say it unless you do X, Y, and Z for me. That is blackmailing somebody. It's also consistent with free speech. So this is just how you want to think of it one way or the other. The point is that people like you, Brian Stelter, and everybody who thinks like you, which basically is the entire corporate media, were furious with Elon Musk before he ever did anything, when he just said, I'm going to buy Twitter to make it a free speech platform. And these giant advertisers, people like, say, Disney, who pulled a whole lot of advertising from Twitter, you can say that, oh, that's just the free market and they have a right to pull their advertising. But the reality, as we all know, is that these giant companies are completely in bed with government. And they're all kind of representative of the establishment. And there's actually Vivek Ramaswamy did a very good job in his book, what was it called? Woke Capitalism, of kind of breaking a lot of this down, where these like diversity, equity, and inclusion rules don't just come out of nowhere. It's, you know what I mean? Like, it's quite often that you'll have, like, say, the people who manage the pensions of public sector workers for different states. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars worth when you add them all up. We'll only allocate that capital to companies that have these standards. And there's all this type of like, just this blob of cronyism. And so, yes, when these giant corporations are all threatening just this one social media company with pulling out their advertising, it's not exactly just like, oh, this is just a free speech and free markets issue. I don't know. Any other thoughts you have on all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. It's not a free markets thing. It's pretty obvious that all these corporations are getting together and saying, we're going to involve ourselves in censorship. That's when Disney made a statement, pulling jobs out of Atlanta over abortion. Mm-hmm. And it's because of money. I can't point the direct route, but it's because of money that's injected by the Fed and who it's made available to, or what kind of protectionism you're getting from people in government, or you're getting a call from some legal group that's saying, we're going to make some trouble or waves. You got to get on board with this. This is not free market stuff. The free market solution over time is going to be if these companies get so displaced by other advertisers that come onto the platform, and because there's less competition to reach those audiences, are able to get better rates and substantial profits. So, like, for example, if an independent movie studio starts creating movies and very successfully promotes them on Twitter, or if, everyone stops buying Crest toothpaste, or if you see what happened to Bud Light or some of these other beer brands that kind of stepped into that market and said, hell yeah, I'll sell to conservatives. So, without the total grip on freedom, people like information, people like competition. And so these corporations, I think they're going to lose out long term, where they just see enough profits getting displaced as they're bidding each other up just to be on the mat of the NHL, because that's the only thing that they've deemed as safe. And so they're all competing for just to have their company name on the NHL rink, which how much of an impact does that really make? Listen, over enough time, I'm not afraid that Twitter's going to fold. And if you don't think other advertisers aren't going to step in because there's better rates because all these major corporations don't want to be there, that signals to me, hey, there's an opportunity. These rates are going to be lower.
There are some important points that he made in this one paragraph, and I just want to summarize them here from a post that we shared on X over the weekend. Of course, you should be following us over there at 10th Amendment. 1, governments don't like it when people are armed. Why? Because when they are, just that on its own, just merely the people being armed, can create a scenario where the people could throw off even the biggest military establishment. It's not guaranteed, but Madison is suggesting that it's possible on its own. Even against highly trained regulars, a professional permanent standing army. 3, the Constitution is an improvement on this scenario, is his take, because it provides for local control over the militia and the state governments. He said, this 1-2 punch guarantees that no tyranny would be able to stop the people or the states, the people and the states combined. And of course, the caveat here that I keep mentioning for today is that Madison's argument is important today, and this is from another post on X, for people who tell us that because there are so many millions of firearms, a new revolution, a new war for independence from D.C. would stop the empire. Now, Madison says just the number of arms on its own and people willing to use them, it could be done, but it's not certain, especially when you're talking about the largest military empire on earth, and you really want to get the states pushing towards liberty and to nullify federal gun control into oblivion where it belongs. So the first step, he said, is the disquietude of the people. And James Madison, this is from an article that I published, this is back in 2016, but I think it's decent. Probably could use a few edits, but it's pretty solid. Madison expected the people would throw a fit when the feds usurped power or tried to implement unpopular policies. So of course the people have to be outspoken, because if everybody keeps their mouths shut, then you can't rally to the cause. John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, just as a quick aside, in his great Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767, the most widely read documents on American liberty till the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776, well, he told us that concordia res parve crescunt. It's a Latin phrase that means small things grow great by concord. He was pointing out that as they were attacking New York from the British Parliament, if you turned a blind eye and you just kept your mouth shut about it, well, sooner or later they're going to use that as a precedent to come after other people. So the very smallest thing, and it still is a thing, is to raise awareness. So he was calling on the other colonies to just pass non-binding resolutions as a first step at that time, opposing the Parliament's action. Because what that does is it rallies people to the cause. It makes them aware of it. So the people do have to be very outspoken. We should never shut up about federal gun control. Well, I mean, all gun control, of course, but we're just trying to focus on this one particular strategy that uses this approach by James Madison against the federal government. And I think a lot of the state-level gun control really is funded by federal programs as well, whether it's the drug war or joint task forces or just all the federal grant funding that comes into the state. So we really have to actually kind of sever the relationships between the states and the federal government on all kinds of stuff if we really want to protect the right to keep and bear arms, our natural right of self-defense. So this first step is very straightforward. Just kind of sound off as constantly as possible about how bad all the gun control programs are. And I'm not just talking about the ones from the current dude, because those are terrible, but what about the ones from the previous dude and back and back and back and back? We're going all the way back to 1934, the National Firearms Act. None of this stuff should exist. So number 2, their repugnance. So we start with the disquietude of the people, and then their repugnance and perhaps a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And now, if you're like me, you look at this whole situation and the gun grabbers as totally disgusting, repugnant, like makes your skin crawl. You got to wash when you talk to them. And that's absolutely true. I mean, if it isn't, then, well, you're probably on the side of the gun grabbers, and that's not a good thing. But it is repugnant, but that's not how it was used in this context. When you read some of this stuff, we can go way off base if we don't actually understand the context and the definition of the words used at the time. Now, the number one, just popular dictionary of the time defined the word repugnance as, quote, disobedient, not obsequious, so not compliant. So the non-compliance of the people on the one hand, and then at the same time, a direct refusal to cooperate with officers of the union on the other hand, which also ties in with step 4, state legislative advice, which I'll get to in a moment as well. So if you want to start, this is back to my article, if you want to stop the federal government, you have to disobey them. Madison also suggested that people would perhaps directly refuse to cooperate with federal agents. Now, if you're not complying with something, you're not always having a direct interaction with a federal agent. So you have to have that kind of 1-2 punch, because if they're not helping in enforcement, for example, and I'll cover this more as well in this episode, if the people are still complying, if they're still obeying what the feds tell them to obey, you can't nullify anything. The feds will never repeal stuff if everyone complies. So number 3 is the frowns of the executive magistracy of the state. Here, Madison envisions governors formally protesting federal actions. Governors are very popular. They get a lot of media coverage today. So when they're out there championing a cause and railing on what's coming out of Washington, D.C., it doesn't stop anything. We can't count on a single person to stop things, but we want the governor to use their kind of bully pulpit to create attention. And they won't do that unless it's popular for them. So they have to know. I mean, if there's plenty of disobedience by the people, that drives. If we think about the steps that Madison is talking about here, first, the people have to be really upset. And then they stop complying. They refuse to comply. They disobey the feds. That drives the governor to start talking about it. When the governor starts talking about it, that leads to the next step, which is legislative action. James Madison called this legislative devices, which would often be added on such occasions. And this is really important because this is, if you tie this in with his number 2, which is a refusal to cooperate with officers of the union, we can also tie that in not just with the people at large, but the states don't have to help the federal government violate your rights. The states don't have to help the federal government do anything. If it's a federal act and you think the thing should be done by the federal government should stop doing all the stuff that it's not supposed to do, so it has the funds and resources to do that. It's the stuff that it's supposed to do. But instead, they've got their kind of dirty little fingers in anything and everything that covers our entire lives. And in order to do that, they rely on the states to implement basically everything. So a refusal to cooperate with officers of the union by individuals, disobedience by the individuals, and of course by the state, saying we will not help you enforce the Gun Control Act of 1968 or the bump stock ban or whatever it is. Any of it. You could say all of it, part of it, just stuff that's coming down the line. Single issues, whatever. You just got to get the ball rolling inch by inch, as Jefferson told us. Well, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. I believe that liberty, that freedom, that markets are more powerful than government over time, and when the people are on board and they can get their states to back them up, even if you just crack the door open a little bit, this sets the stage for a floodgate in the future.
Defense Head calls out those who advocate isolationism and an American retreat from responsibility. Now, we're going to have to talk about that word responsibility because it's used a lot. And I read your column earlier today, and I would say if I summarize your column, I would actually use the great words of an old cartoon strip called Pogo, which is that Lloyd Austin has seen the enemy and the enemy is us. And that's exactly what he's saying. And and at first you'd say, well, this doesn't seem very nice. But in fact, and you touch on this, I think, in your piece today, it's kind of a good sign that he's frustrated. He's angry at non-interventionists. He calls them isolationists, but at non-interventionists. And I think why it's a good sign, Dr. Paul, because I think it shows that he's frustrated. And I think it shows if things were going well, he wouldn't have said this. He would have had no reason to single out the people who were opposed to all of these interventions if the interventions were going well. If Ukraine was swimming along and the Russians were about to have a Maidan of their own, he wouldn't be talking about it. If this mess in Israel hadn't completely devolved into a bloodbath that has a good chunk of Biden's voting base furious with him, he wouldn't be upset, he wouldn't be concerned. And the fact is that there's a growing tide of opposition to this overseas adventurism, and I think that's why Lloyd Austin brought it up, because he's getting nervous, they're starting to concern themselves, and so they need to point inward at the internal enemy.
In a way, the discussion that we want to have and continuously push the argument about bankruptcy. It's hard to spend the money if you don't have it, or you have to seal it, or you have to print it, and that causes all of our problems. But this has led to gridlock. The gridlock that we have there is really, there's people changing their minds about intervention, but they're also changing their minds or becoming more realistic that it doesn't last forever. You just can't print money forever without suffering the consequences. And so Austin Austin even emphasizes it. You guys need to pass the budget.
Yeah.
You need to pass the budget because, and he uses it in his promotion. We need more war spending.
Yeah.
You know, he was very, very pointed on why we needed more war spending. And he does talk about, you know, we have to be concerned about national security. You know, be a good patriot. And I guess they had a pretty neat conference out there in California at Reagan Rand's, and Reagan at least had a little bit different attitude, but non-interventionism has not seen the light like it should.
But with that said, Reagan distinguished himself from today's neocons by the fact that he was willing to talk to people. I mean, we've talked about it on the show many times. He met with Gorbachev in Reykjavik at a time where it was intense personal, political vulnerability on his part. And the neocons were furious that he met with Gorbachev to try to figure out how we can end this nuclear threat. So he took a lot of personal risks for diplomacy's sake to speak with people. But if you look at today's coterie of neocons, you have someone like Blinken. He goes over to Netanyahu and says, hey, can you please stop killing so many people? Netanyahu says, no. And so Blinken says, okay, so, all right, sorry to bother you. I'm going to go home now. So that's basically how it's been working. But you interestingly enough, and I highlighted this, so we have a brain meld here. Go to the next clip. The audience was interesting that he was talking to, and maybe that explains the message. The United States must reject calls to turn away from global interests and become more isolationist, Austin told, quote, an audience of lawmakers, corporate and defense leaders, and government officials. So basically, he's telling his customers, because as everyone knows, he was on the board of Raytheon. He's eyeball deep in the military-industrial complex. He's telling his future colleagues, because you better believe as soon as he gets out of this office, he's going to put his snout right back in the trough. He's saying, hey guys, we got some problems. We got these stupid isolationists around. Don't worry, we can manage them. We'll take care of them. We're going to keep the money flowing.
But he did recognize that there were some economic problems, and we have to work to keep up full employment and keep the money flowing and keep everybody doing well. But he was claiming that it will create tens of thousands of new jobs and well distributed. They'll be in at least 30 states, and that's good. That's good for politics and good to get votes. You know, the lobbyists like that term. You know, okay, to spread it out, equal distribution. And they precisely mentioned an amount of $50 billion for that little jobs program.
Yeah.
But you know, this idea of a jobs program, somebody said, you know, some people believe still that war produces high employment. And I say, well, there's a little bit of truth to that because we were in a depression, and the depression really didn't end in World War II because people were very depressed and they were poor. Yeah. But there wasn't unemployment. They drafted millions of people, you know, to go, and many of them lost their lives. So they say, well, that's employment. And they don't distinguish the two. You know, if you can have unemployment, but you know what? It's very easy to argue a case that is you just make slaves of them because I use the term, and I think legitimately, that when you have a draft, which we had most of our recent history, 100 years or so, we've used the draft for World War I and World II and Korea. So there are people who didn't want to go, and they were drafted. They'd say, "Oh, we're creating jobs," but they claim, "Oh no, we're talking about jobs in military plants."
Yeah.
And then, of course, the people who end up paying with the inflation and the taxes, that somebody's paying for those jobs. It'd be better off just to leave people alone.